Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you especially Professor Ajdinović for speaking with us today. We're very excited to hear you. It is my pleasure to introduce the first of our spring semester new faculty lectures. Our speaker today, as I just said, is Miloš Ajdinović, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Mass Communication. We're also really happy that he is teaching classes in the English department as well, in the area of screenwriting. Professor Ajdinović earned his Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in film and television directing at the Faculty of Dramatic Arts in Belgrade, Serbia, and a Master of Fine Arts in Emerging Media MFA in Entrepreneurial Digital Cinema at the University of Central Florida. Professor Ajdinović is a filmmaker whose narrative, documentary, and video artwork has been shown at multiple national and international film festivals and galleries. His latest film project, the feature film Goodbye White Guy, will have its world premiere at this year's Cinequest Film and VR Festival in San Jose, California. And I think we may hear some more about this very exciting new film today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ajdinović, who will be speaking on dialects of improvised filmmaking and cinema frame as the space of encounter. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Macy. And welcome everyone. Thank you for being here and listening to my presentation on my, I'm going to call it artistic and research process. I just have a disclaimer to make before I begin, and that's that the actual film is way more interesting than this talk. I just want to make that clear. So my talk today primarily revolves around the production of the narrative feature film Goodbye White Guy. As Dr. Macy mentioned, I'm also work a lot within the field of documentary work, but I am also a narrative filmmaker, and today I would like to share a little bit about my, as I said, artistic and research process dealt with the production of this narrative film. So I have included here a little bit of the technical specs and production information about the film for anybody who might be interested in that. So Goodbye White Guy is a 99-minute feature-length narrative film. It had a budget of $30,000, which firmly places it into the category of a micro-budget film. And I should also add that the major part of the budget went on post-production. So the actual production was significantly cheaper, let's say it like that. So it's 16:9 HD color film. It took the filming took place in India over a period of 25 days in June 2017, so 5 years ago. That's how long it took us. We took a 7-person crew covering over 63 locations in the course of those 25 days, and generating over 60 hours of material. And then it took some 4 years and some months to actually go through that chaos and find a storyline that made sense to us. And then, as Dr. Macy mentioned, something that is not included in this slide, some information that's not included, is that the film will premiere at this year's Cinequest Film Festival in San Jose. So it will have its world premiere in April, and then it will also be a part of the in-person event that takes place in August. Now, one aspect of the film that is the topic of this lecture is that the film was made completely through a long-form improvisation process without the use of any kind of screenplay, nor outline, or even a premise. It was completely created on the spot through, as I said, through this improvisation workshop as a part of an ongoing research project, one which I began together with my colleague, Phil Peters from the University of Central Florida. And I still call this an ongoing project because I still have hope. However, I have to admit that the pandemic has proven to be a worthy opponent in kind of like stopping us to take the research project to the next phase. I just want to. I've included this slide because this is the entire equipment. This is all of the equipment that was used in the course of production of this film, and as you can see, it's very rudimentary. It's very scarce, even compared to other micro-budget productions. And this was to a degree done intentionally. And I will talk a little bit about this idea of a kind of adopting the scarce rudimentary method in capturing the performance. It kind of like not allowing the crew to the possibility even of stylizing, and just kind of like focusing on what is in front of the camera. During the pre-production, the performers researched and then created detailed characters without any knowledge, because the overarching narrative did not exist. So only the characters existed. And in addition to that, so the performer would only know what their character would know in the film. So nobody knew what the other person is going to be playing. So once the long form improvisation starts, you only have the information that your character would have in that moment. And then the actual narrative, the actual plot of the film was created during the filming, those 25 days in Chennai and Pondicherry in India. We took a couple of three performers from the US, and then in India, we hired performers from India, both professional actors and non-actors. The method itself is pretty inclusive. It does not require for somebody to be a professional. We took some students. Also, some of the actors were students at the time of filming. Now, before I get into the aesthetics, I wanted to try and explain by giving sort of like a visual analogy to the artistic process, and I hope this will help to explain what is it that I'm trying to do and we were trying to do with this film. So I'm going to show you an image, a drawing, and this is done by Forrest DeBlois, and this is courtesy of the author. This work in progress. It started in 2018. There is this approach to drawing, which I find really, really fascinating. It can be used, and it's often used as a teaching tool for beginner students who are just basically learning how to look, learning how to see. But it can also be an artistic process in its own right. So what happens, and what I'm talking about is just the portrait part of this image. So the artist looks at the subject and then measures, and usually the measurement is only done by eye. Tries to determine where a particular spot, where a point is on the page, and then very meticulously, very slowly draws a line, trying to follow every nook and cranny, never taking their eye off the subject. So it's like you're imagining that you're going over the subject with your pencil. I don't know how clear it is to see in this portrait but there isn't a single straight line there, and most of the lines, well, at least to me, when I look at them, they look like fjords on geographical maps. So the idea is, once your eye locks onto what you perceive to be a line, then you just allow your eye to follow it. You're just allow the line to lead you. So there is no plan, there is no sketch. This is basically a sketch. You immediately start from the sketch. There's no any kind of, if it's painting, there isn't any kind of underpainting. You just follow the line and you don't worry about what is going to become at the end. Now, one other aspect of this process that is, again, really, really fascinating to me is that after the line has been drawn, the artist measures again, And then if if it's a little bit off, they do not completely remove it. They just lightly erase it, or as they say, they push it into the background, and then they try to make a more precise line over it. So if you, again, I don't know if it's easy to see, but actually in this portrait, we can see those lines that are pushed in the background. And then over time, these mistakes, the so-called mistakes, would accumulate and then create a specific texture that gives the drawing its look. So the actual aesthetic, actual style of the drawing comes from the accumulation of mistakes, basically. Now, an artist who uses a very similar approach, not exactly the same, is Antonio Lopez Garcia, a Spanish painter, who appears in Victor Reis's documentary El Sol del Membrillo, which is one of the most important documentary works on the artistic process. And I don't know if anybody has seen the documentary, but I'm just going to briefly retell. So it is a documentary about Antonio Lopez Garcia, who attempts to first paint and then draw this fruit tree in his backyard. And it takes him several months, and he's unsuccessful in the end because he's very meticulous in his approach. And again, this is an approach that takes a lot of measuring, looking into what is absolutely in front of you, and then trying to recreate it on the page, on the paper, or on the canvas. And I read this somewhere, and please forgive me, I lost this source. So, but someone wrote on Garcia's work, it is as if with every move of the brush and dab of paint, the artist is asking, am I really here? So when I talk about my artistic practice, I want to say that at the core of it is the relationship to the immediate reality, something that's immediately in front of us as the crew, as the ensemble. And what I want to use the camera for, I want to use it in a similar fashion that Forrest Dublois or Antonio Lopez Garcia use their pen or their brush. With every frame with every image that we create, we want to try and ask and immediately give answer to the question, are we really here? So this approach belongs to a tiny but distinct branch in the history of cinema. It begins with the work of Jean Renoir and his collective adventures. It's then taken over by the authors of the French New Wave, which comes at a point where the equipment becomes lightweight enough so that you can actually take a camera and go onto a location and follow actually become much more looser in the way that you apply the camera. So we can definitely see improvisation work of Jean-Luc Godard, especially his La Chinoise period, Jacques Rivette, Eric Rohmer also used a lot of improvisation. One of the films that really informed our work on Goodbye White Guy was a film by Jacques Rosier, Adieu Philippine, which is a film in which was made in a similar fashion, where each scene that was shot would inform the next plot point of the film. So film follows three characters, three young people who are in a sort of love triangle relationship as they meander from Paris to south of France. But every scene is informed by the improvisation that happened in the previous scene. And then definitely the American actor and author John Cassavetes is somebody who was a major influence in the way we approached this film. In the UK, we have Mike Leigh, who also uses improvisation, but in a little bit different fashion compared to Cassavetes. In Denmark, we have Dogma 95, and especially work by Lars von Trier, a film called The Idioten, which especially uses improvisation and this raw performance to build its own style. And then digging even more into history, improvisation, of course, comes from theater, comes from theatrical performance, and then one of the major inspirations for Goodbye White Guy, for the whole idea of creating a workshop and then taking it to India, comes from the work of Peter Brook in his theater experiments conducted in Africa, which are described in a book, The Conference of the Birds. The experiments are completely different from what we did, but the whole idea of leading an ensemble in such a way comes from there. Now, the standard model of production that dominates global film industry is sometimes referred to as the assembly line production, and it's because it's literally adopted from Henry Ford's car manufacturing system. And it's interesting, initially it was set up so that it can eradicate any notion of improvisation from the filmmaking process. Here we have Thomas Ince. Thomas Ince, in most film history resources, is emphasized as the person who was really against any kind of improvisation, who really took Ford's ideas and applied it to filmmaking process in his install studios. And he attempted to modernize and introduce efficiency, as well as to battle the often frivolous crews of film pioneers of the day, who repeatedly disregarded any notion of coherent storytelling, narrative continuity, or at the very least, the expense of the filmmaking process. Or they were, in other words, they were spending too much money by constantly not knowing what they were doing. So Thomas Ince installed this very rigorous hierarchy in the filmmaking process that was led by the hierarchy at the top of which was the producer, which is immediately adopted by most major Hollywood motion picture studios, and then it became global. So for example, when I went to film school in Serbia, the industry, the so-called industry model, the assembly line model, was something that was thought, that was presented to us, even though Serbian film in history, Serbian film and Yugoslavian film have almost nothing to do with Hollywood, have almost no connection to Hollywood, but they still adopted kind of like the same doctrines. This is not, I don't want to come off as overly critical towards, because there are good sides about the industry model of production. The efficiency sometimes is very important, but it is something that was always very interesting to me. And one of the characteristics of this process of the industry model is that the actual film set, the actual moment when you are making the film is seen more as an execution than exploration. So usually we'll hear, when you come on set, you always have to know what is it that you are making. And there is a famous quote from Alfred Hitchcock, who said that in the ideal world, you wouldn't even have a film set. You would immediately, from the typewriter, the film would emerge, the visuals would emerge. So the ideal, the paradigm of this industry model would be to completely eradicate the film set where people meet. So in opposition to this approach, we attempted to envision cinema as the collaborative endeavor and collective adventure. And I like to use that term, collective adventure. This is a term that film historian Gilles Muelich uses to describe the process of the father of improvisation cinema, Jean Renoir. And then Muelich says, the filmmaker who improvises is seeking for the demonstration of a work in progress, and they view the creative process as a journey or even a sketch or a draft. So again, we have this notion of the sketch, of something that is not finished, that is almost like a mistake, but that is left in the final, again, I hate using the word product, but in final film. But it is that mistake, it is that nature of the sketch that gives it its style, its its aesthetics. Now, improvisation as a technique is a teaching tool in different kinds of performance classes. It's an important element in the Stanislavski system, where it's called the active analysis, and all the various schools that come off from this system, method acting, Meisner system, they, to a degree, less or more, they adopt some sort of improvisational work. Then I'm not going to directly deal with it, but you cannot talk about improvisation without mentioning the work of Second City, a landmark American performance institution that popularized the so-called improv. And in most cases, when I talk to people, when I mention improvisation, they usually think that I'm talking about improv. That's how famous it is. And for the last couple of decades, even more than the last couple of decades, alumni of the Second City have been dominating, crowding big screens, small screens, all the red carpet events. So we just have to mention that they do exist. They've given a lot to the notion of improvisation in art. And then improvisation has, especially through the work of Second City, improvisation has found its place in the industry model. So today, or even again a couple of decades ago, for example, major motion picture author Robert Altman is known for using improvisation in his work, for incorporating improvisation as a technique, as something that brings vitality and freshness to the performance. These days, major television producer Armando Iannuzzi is also known as somebody who uses a lot of improvisation in their own work. But I want to take us back to this old notion of improvisation, something that's raw and destructive, and something that creates mistakes, again, something that creates that texture that needs to be captured. So Jean Renoir is the first one to seriously consider the aesthetics of this approach. He was inspired by jazz artists, his jazz contemporaries in America, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and he tried to utilize filming techniques to free his actors and enable them to improvise. Now, this is very important because it's not that he just adopted this theatrical technique, but he tried to figure out a way how to introduce it, how to make it a part of the film set. So for example, he insisted on shooting with multiple cameras and then used no dubbing. Now at the time, dubbing was something that was a standard in production. It was very complicated to conduct a film set without the use of later of ADR and dubbing. But he insisted on doing it because he wanted, again, to capture that natural, raw performance. He then devised a style from this. The backgrounds in his films, if you pay attention, they're very chaotic. They're filled with unpredictable movements. And then he would place his main characters in front, highlighted, set apart, and he would always try to capture this dichotomy of something that is clearly controlled, that clearly is a part of the artist's intention, and something that's a complete random chaos. And that gives his films this very interesting texture that they have, and makes them fresher than the films of his contemporaries of the time, with other filmmakers from the 30s. And then I've just included this quote from him about the work on the rules of the game, probably the most well-known film of his that uses improvisation, and that's we were cut off from the rest of the world and the whole atmosphere, the actors and the landscape, and also the subject, as I said earlier, really spurred me on and drove me to do masses of things that were not initially planned. So this is an artist who had a plan, he had a script, and then this process takes him to a detour. And then what is also interesting to me is this, again, notion that they're cut off from the rest of the world. This often comes up in this kind of work where you have to go somewhere, where you have to be cut off from your immediate reality. So maybe it has to do with with our ability to look into our immediate surroundings and kind of like try to engage with them in maybe a fresher way. I wanted to mention Renoir, and I also wanted to talk briefly about John Cassavetes, who again is kind of like a main point of influence for this kind of work. I hate doing this where I talk about films without actually seeing those films. I think it would be much better for me if we would just watch a Cassavetes movie and then talk about it afterwards. But I'm going to do my best to try to describe it a little bit for if there's anybody here who hasn't seen at least one Cassavetes film. So his films are very erratic. They're very unpolished. They're filled with improvised dialogue. Most of his films lack a traditional narrative structure and instead present situations or problems that his ensemble would explore. Ray Carney is one of the leading Cassavetes experts, and he writes about Cassavetes that Cassavetes refuses to straighten out narrative loops and twists so that individual scenes would smoothly advance the plot. The acting releases energies that the story can't control. The fidelity to impulse makes Cassavetes the Jackson Pollock of cinema. And I do want to point out that Cassavetes did write scripts, and very detailed scripts for all of his work, but would then on the set he would insist that his actors, so he would treat those scripts as the problem to explore, as an assignment for the actor to try and find out a way on how to play a particular role. Now, again, here we have a situation where a filmmaker he's not just adopting a technique, he's devising a way to look at this new way, a new performance. So again, we have two handheld cameras. Cameramen are instructed to follow actors no matter what happens. Nobody can stop. Once the camera starts rolling, nobody can stop it, and then Cassavetes would insist on rolling as long as possible. For this reason, his films ended up being really expensive, and he was an independent producer. He struggled a lot in his career trying to just get the resources to make his films. He is in the mainstream. He's way more known as the actor, but what he was actually doing, he was taking all these acting roles. He was in Polanski's Rosemary's Baby and in Dirty Dozen. He would take on those roles so that he would have money to continue shooting his films. Again, it was really obsessed with finding a way to capture this rawness. He would work with the same ensemble over and over. Again, he would write characters for specific actors, fusing the imagined concepts with social inhibitions of his real collaborators. He was a little bit of a manipulative person because he was trying to deny them the possibility of hiding behind the text. So he really tried his best to eradicate this, the polished part, the polished aspect of film, any notion of style. Which brings me to Goodbye White Guy, and this idea of collective working on a problem using the artistic means of improvised cinema. Again, I hate describing the movie. I much prefer to just show you the movie. And hopefully, after we have our world premiere, there will be an opportunity to screen the film for faculty and students at UCO. I would love to do that, but I'm going to describe it. So it is a road movie. If anybody who watches it finds anything funny about it, sees it as a comedy, I don't mind. It follows a couple of protagonists through the Indian landscape, which I already mentioned. Now, I did say there was no clearly established premise, but we were looking at other films when we began talking about it. So what I was particularly interested in, looking at other films that have a similar setting, is this cinema trope of sort of like broken, down on their luck Westerners who traveled to this, quote unquote, distant land to usually find some psychological or often spiritual healing in the exoticized East. So this unsettling narrative of dislocated Western catharsis set against the backdrop of the other world, as it has been shown in numerous films. Most of our research came from the Hollywood of the 80s, was particularly interested in showing that trope, but even more recent films. I know we looked a lot at Darjeeling Limited by Wes Anderson, or Lost in Translation by Sofia Coppola, which takes place in Japan, but kind of like has a similar trope where it presents Japan as something that is exotic, that is foreign to us. And this is by no means an attempt to be overly critical to those films. It's just that one singular trope is something that we distilled from those films and try to use it as this problem or a set of problems. So present it to our ensemble and then have them play through it and try to come up with a solution, some sort of answer. It doesn't have to be, it's not a solution, it's an answer, and it can be it can be a wrong answer. But the important part is that you then include it into your kind of creative dynamics of the workshop. So the problem is the idea of the white body finding its way in an exoticized landscape. The name of the workshop was East Coast Road, and we knew that we were going to film on the East Coast Road, which East Coast Road is a scenic route today, is a scenic route in the Tamil region. It is a highway that emerged from the number of smaller roads connecting fishing villages on the coast. But it's also a road that connected English Madras to French Pondicherry, so two colonies that existed in India. And then it captures this particular colonial tension. So at one point, this does become a backdrop of our film, and our heroes lose themselves on an old colonial road. The performers were encouraged to shift their perspective from the craft aspect of the acting, trying to create a polished performance, into this free-flowing exploratory activity during which the main goal was to observe and interact with rudimentary reality. It is important that they are aware of the leap in the dark nature of their involvement, and they're comfortable with it from the start, which was never true. They were never comfortable with it at any point of filming. What directors who work in this way seem to be striving for, and this is definitely something we were striving for, is the sense of discovery that comes from the unexpected and unpredictable in human behavior. So every micro movement, every gesture would have implications with the emerging larger structure of the piece. Like in the case of Adieu Philippine, every scene filmed would then inform the next step in the plot. And I'm going to stop the share for one moment, and I just want to read my final paragraph. So we're almost done, luckily. So this refers to this idea of not just saying, okay, this is something that belongs to theater, I'm just going to adopt this technique and try to get a fresh performance. But it has to do with building your own aesthetics, building your own style that somehow is also working, it's also improvising with the ensemble. And so the question is, like, what do you do with the camera? How do you position the camera in that situation? Therefore, the long sequence shots discover an absolute chaos and uncontrolled movement that reigns within the space of the frame, and that is manifested through the encounter between the camera eye and accidental reality. This reality, however, does not belong to the frame nor to the performers. It cannot even simply be described as a Western gaze that overshadows a foreign territory. This reality emerges as a separate entity, produced by the complex web of connections and frictions between the camera that reacts like a body thrown into a foreign land, the performers, and their contact with the unknown or the unexpected, and the outside reality that unfolds and constantly resists to be fully grasped or comprehended. Out of this conflictual and frustrating space emerge roughly shaped fragments of a narrative charged with all the mixed input provided by all the agents that were present at the moment of its birth. No polished mise-en-scène could imitate this perfectly messy and uncontrollable choreography of contact. The camera is the one that discovers a reality that does not exist anywhere else except within that space of contact. Thus, the camera becomes more of a research tool, a microscope, or a microscope in a cinematography lab, or a magnifying glass under which otherwise unperceivable, ungraspable fragments appear with all their meanings and different particles. So I like, this is the lecture part or the presentation part of this talk. But what I would like to do now is I would like to invite you to, I'm going to share a clip in the chat.
Thank you so much, Professor Ajdinović, for a wonderful presentation, thoughtful, thought-provoking, savvy, and a really delightful short taste of the forthcoming movie. So bravo, please join me in thanking Professor Ajdinović for this great presentation. And now I think if anybody would like to pose some questions, offer comments, this would be a great time to do it. The floor is open.
Hi, I'll jump in. Thank you so much for the really productive talk, Miloš. I was curious. You brought up the improvisation of the actors. I was curious if you might comment on the improvisational techniques of like the cinematographer or of the editing, or if that might apply in that case. I noticed in the clip that we saw of the shot with one standing on the rocks and the other in the foreground, there was a racking focus between the two of them, and that had to be, I infer that was an improvisational moment of creativity that's happening as the characters or as the actors are improvising. And I was also wondering if you could comment on the way the process for editing here, because the standard is to rationalize through editing to make everything seamless and make insensible. But when you have 60 hours of footage, that's all essentially improvised from character sketches. How do you do that rationalizing work of editing while still preserving the improvisational texture that you're remarking on?
Well, thanks, Matt, for that question, and great catch on the focus racking. I will start by saying that I'm 100% sure that the cinematographer of this film absolutely hates me for doing this to him. I would say that it's as a process very taxing on the cinematographer, the person operating the camera, because Ruben Rogak is the name of the cinematographer. He never knew where the situation is going to. So for example, in the case of this scene, he did not know that Brian, the actor, is going to go up on those rocks. So he immediately, in the moment, has to make a decision on what the composition should be. They immediately work with the focus racking. This is something that 99% of cinematographers would absolutely hate, and he, of course, absolutely hated it. But to me, at least aesthetically, this ambiguous nature of what is going to happen, and then that then is reflected in how the camera behaves, right? Then usually we don't want to feel the presence of the camera. Usually camera in a film is an omnipresent eye that glides through space or is stationary, and when it's stationary, it's very kind of like it is very stationary. So we don't feel the presence of the camera, the body of the camera. But to me, this something is very interesting. This again something that brings texture to the piece, because it does imitate how we behave in reality. Because when we are present in an actual situation, we don't know where we look depending on where our interest is. So for the camera to try to imitate that, for Ruben to stand there with the camera and to try to look where his interest is, that is something that we tried to capture. And of course, it wasn't always successful. And you know, this is a 99-minute film from 60 hours of material, and it would be very difficult to make it a 101-minute film, because there was so much material that we had to discard because it was just unusable. Now, when it comes to editing, and especially, I also want to mention sound design, where, for example, the sound designer who I think likes me still, really appreciated this process, had, you know, you had this opportunity to invent sounds. To a lot of this sound that we hear is not the actual sound from the place, other than the dialogue. So they would be able to, they were able to introduce sounds, or somebody, for example, looks into a direction, he would put sound that kind of like motivates that movement. With the editing, it was there is a great talk, I think it's online, is easily accessible, by the editor. I forgot her name, but she works with Lars von Trier, who during his Dogma period kind of like worked in the same way. And over there, in that talk, she explains that what they discovered is that if they just take the scene and cut out the things that they don't like in that scene, that the audience will fill in the gaps, that the audience is way more forgiving to the material than we usually take them for. And then, of course, now a lot of editors will stop talking to me, because there is craft to editing, and I'm not trying to, you know, invent something that is in total opposition to how films are made or how they're supposed to be made. And there is a lot of truth to the craft of invisible editing, of the invisible cut, right? Making something feel very seamless, having the audience kind of like enjoy a stylized, polished nature of the thing that you're showing. But in this case, what I was interested in was capturing that, those mistakes, those little jarring moments, jarring cuts, because I just felt that it plays nice with the narrative that we were building, that this idea of the camera that doesn't know where to look, that it is not conquering the landscape. The landscape usually it's not just the backdrop, it is also something that is in resistance to the camera that is looking at it. But I thought that was very interesting when we started working on it.
Yeah, other questions or comments or reflections?
I had a question for you. First, I'm very impressed and can't wait to see the film, but you described other filmmakers. How in 20 or 30 years from now would you like someone to describe your films and you as a filmmaker?
Oh, wow. Oh, now we're digging deep. I don't know. I would like for somebody to describe me 20 years from now. Maybe a year from now would also be nice. I don't know. I like this. I feel lucky because I've found the niche that I found my bus stop in the artistic. I've got off the bus and I like where I am. I also, as I mentioned, and also Dr. Macy mentioned, I'm also documentarian. I'm also very interested. So the next step in the hybrid forms. So something that I feel like this can work with documentary very nicely, and forms that combine documentary and the narrative are very interesting to me. So that is something that I would like to work in more, and then maybe in 20 years somebody talks about it, briefly mentions me.
I was going to say, I have a quick question for you, because there does seem to be this tension between planned and unplanned, right? But clearly you were in India and you did a lot of traveling as part of this. So at what point do you feel like, all right, this cannot be completely improvised? How much guidance and forethought was kind of at the forefront of that?
Well, we knew it was going to be a road movie, which immediately, sets boundaries. But I will say, if at some point if we started shooting it and I saw that it was not going towards a road movie, it would not be a road movie. We were ready to go wherever it takes us. But I'm really adamant about the fact that absolutely there was no outline. Everything that happens in the film is completely improvised. And the reason why I say that is because I do feel, and hopefully the audience will also, that there is a strong, coherent storyline with the twist. Everything that the Hollywood demands is there, and it was all made through this. We can say, we were lucky. This is like totally unacceptable anecdote, but when I finished shooting, I went to Serbia, and then in Serbia, they're walking in Belgrade. I saw a friend of mine who I had no idea he became a priest. And then he wanted to sit and have a drink with me. And then he started asking me about what am I doing and what's going on. And then he became really, really interested and started asking me about this process and what are we doing? How are we going to India to shoot the movie? And he really asked every possible detail. In the end, he said, wow, you're a bigger believer than I am. We really took a risk with this idea, like, is it going to become something that's coherent?
Okay. Thank you. I think Dr. Petit has a question as well.
Hvala, Miloš. Very interesting work. You've been here in Oklahoma second semester. So tell us, working with mass comm students, English students, other non-majors, you got a new sandbox now, Oklahoma. So what are some of the ideas that are going on about projects, working with students and things?
Oh, now you're putting me on the spot. Thank you, Timothy. I'm trying to conceptualize something, and I'm trying to start the work. But I would like to still remain silent on where it's going to take me. But I will say that it's very, at least for me, I love being here, and like there's a lot of potential for me to explore possible narratives.
I have a very minor question, but it caught my attention. The dogs, did they just wander up, or were they part of your traveling crew? And how often do animals change what's going on with the actors in the film?
They were not part of our crew, but they just wandered in the shot, and we left them in. There are a lot of stray dogs in India. There are a lot of documentaries about stray dogs in India. It's a very controversial also subject over there. But they're mostly they're everywhere. They're mostly harmless, so the crew did not have any kind of like issues with that, and would play off the dogs, right? Whatever happened. There are a lot of dogs in the film. There are a lot of dogs in the shot. They're very smart. So they acted well.
I just have a quick comment to follow up what Roz says. I really liked the short clip that you shared, and I really look forward to it being shown at UCO. But I felt like while I was watching it, that because I knew the actors were improvising, I kept thinking, and while these real people are around, I kept thinking, what's going to happen? Anything could happen. Something's going to change this narrative. So it almost made me as an audience member more participatory. in it because I was trying to anticipate what might happen or what might change or something. So I just thought I would share that with you as someone who's not in the field, but just watching.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's like I wrote it for you to say it at the end. Thank you. I really appreciate that comment.
Well, thank you again, Professor Ajdinović, for a wonderful presentation and a great discussion. I very much look forward to seeing the film in its entirety. So I think that is worth a round of applause. Clap, there we go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I hope you have a great afternoon and evening. If you like snow, I hope that you get some flakes. If you don't like snow, I hope it is a snow-free evening for you. Take care. Bye-bye.